Hey everyone, it's Russ. Welcome to another episode of Women's Retirement Radio. Today is the third in an ongoing series about caregiving, and I'm thrilled again to be joined by Lisa Kaufman and Laura Jalbert. Hey ladies, thanks for joining us.
Yeah,
thanks for having us.
Yeah, so today we want to kind of continue the conversation around caregiving and specifically the role of caregiving as a spouse. So caring for a spouse that's dealing with dementia, mental impairment, maybe physical, recovering from an injury, whatever the situation may be. And I think it's safe to say that no one, while they can intellectually think about what it might be like to have to care for their spouse, I don't think many people plan for it in terms of like, this is, at age 68 or 73, we plan to have a caregiving experience. So, and it can really be a shock to the system, especially if you've done a good job of planning and thinking about your retirement and your kind of retirement years together. So I would love to hear your thoughts on this idea of how do you deal with, and we talked about a little bit in our last segment about this idea of evolution and this ongoing change, this kind of dynamic situation, but how do you make sure, or how do you continue to care for yourself while you're caring for your spouse in this example?
Laura, you want to go?
Sure. So I think one of the first things that you can do together, if possible, but certainly on your own, is to acknowledge that this is not what my expectation was. I think that is very powerful in itself. Because you are then separating the reality of what your current situation is from the expectation that perhaps you were attached to for a very long time. I know, I'm not yet retired, sadly, but I continue to daydream about what retirement will be like. And I think it's, significant when you get there and it's not what you planned. And so I think the very first piece of that is to acknowledge it and to look at, maybe even some grief around that, because most people daydream about what it's like to be retired for a long time before they get there. And I think once you get there, there may be some sadness that, oh boy, this is going to be different, some fear. And so I think just stopping and calling it out and taking a look at it is probably a great first step. And like I say, if you can do so with your partner, if they're cognitively intact enough, or an illness is not so far progressed that you can have these conversations, I think it's very validating for both partners to be able to say, holy cow, we just got one bad hand of poker here and we're gonna have to play this through.
Agreed.
So just starting with acknowledgement.
Yeah. Yeah, I can see that being an important first step, and one probably that gets skipped over a lot. And I'd like to add too, by the way, that even if you've got all your financial ducks in a row, whether you've got long-term care insurance in place, or whether you've prepared yourself to handle the financial responsibilities of caregiving, we're talking more about the mental, emotional, psychological impacts, which can oftentimes, I think, be much more impactful than even the financial considerations. So let's say that the caregiver has acknowledged the situation. Maybe they've dealt with some level of grief. How can they? And let's assume, for purposes of this conversation, that you're caring for your spouse who's still at home for the moment. How can you be a supporting caregiver without losing your own personal identity, without losing, losing grips with, things that you like to do when you have the time, your personal interests, hobbies, things like that. Any thoughts on that?
I have some thoughts. I think that when you become a caregiver and you jump in totality, that's when you risk losing your own identity. And just like when you're seeing retirement approaching, if you haven't figured out how you're going to structure your day, retirement isn't going to look the way you maybe thought it would. The days start to run together. It's not unlike what we're all have been experiencing for 2 years, that, are at home and sometimes don't get out of our pajamas, or we don't shower and don't know what day it is, because why bother? You don't want to find yourself in this position of missing out on valuable opportunities because you weren't prepared. And it doesn't mean that you have to over prepare, but having a conversation, with your wealth planner or a therapist or a friend or, a colleague, somebody that you can start looking at. I'm going to have this chunk of time now. My responsibilities have changed in whatever way they have. How are you going to adapt to that? And to make sure that you still do the things that you like to do. Maybe not as much time, you may not have as much time, but you may have to schedule yourself in there. Put it on your calendar so that you make sure that you get your nails done if that's important to you, or you bake bread if that's important to you, or get to see grandchildren, whatever it is that you feel like you need to do that needs to be prioritized. You may not have a whole lot of time like you maybe once did, but making sure you still make some time in there once a week, that you get that time for yourself. And that's where the team approach that we talked about in the last episode comes in so handy, so that you have people who know your spouse and know how to take care of your spouse, and that they are accepting of that care, because that's a challenge as well. We talk about that at a whole other time, when there's nobody else there and the caregiving bond is so strong that they won't allow anyone else to provide care. You don't want to get in that situation because you don't get a break. So you want to set things up for success so that you have some downtime to yourself to do the things that you like to do.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the key components of getting to that place is making sure that you are communicating about what those things are, and communicating to your support system, however small or large, right? Because we were talking about the team. How much of the team have you built for yourself? Well, maybe if you are suddenly thrust into caregiver role, you have not yet built much of the team. But if you have extended family, if you have children, grandchildren, those kind of things, I think just communicating with everyone about the needs of the person you are caring for, but also your own needs, and making sure that those are considered a priority by you, but also by everyone. Because I think one of the things that we see is that caregivers then don't fiercely protect that self time. It slowly, if they started out with some time on their own, it tends to erode away into more caregiving responsibilities and less self-care. And so I think, if you can communicate from the beginning with your support system that, like, it's really important that I get these walks in, or it's really important that I do whatever it is once a week, and I'm going to need your help to do it, because I may not need it for the first year, but if this were to change and I couldn't leave him or her alone, I would need help. And to start looking at how to protect that time from the very beginning, by communicating with those who are already in your support system.
I want to throw an example out there, if I may, if we have time.
Yeah, please do.
I have seen on occasion where the family caregiver, who has always been the spouse, finally gets to a place where they cannot take care of their loved one at home anymore, which they were late coming to that decision. And when they've placed their loved one, and oftentimes it's a nursing home because it's gone too long, and then they still go every day and do all of the things that the people that they're paying to do. So they're paying for stuff and they're doing it anyway. And then there's resentment and exhaustion and overwhelm and anger and all those other delightful emotions, because they're not releasing control, because they don't trust that anybody's going to do it the way they would do it, which is probably true. But it doesn't mean it's not going to get done, or that the individual's going to be safe. And I feel like they're giving up their lives by going and sitting in the nursing home and making sure that they fed their husband lunch 7 days a week. Okay, well, here's they're safe and cared for. Why aren't you doing some of the things you want to be doing? Because they were a caregiver for so long, they've lost that. So it's a slippery slope. And now, when you have that care in place, you may not need too many days off in the beginning, but you may get to this point where it's beyond what you're physically able to do. And it's okay to take yourself back when somebody else is providing that level of care.
Yeah. But, I think in that, and I think we may be thinking of the same kinds of clients, Lisa. In in that case, one of the greatest challenges for those caregivers, though, is relinquishing that control and getting okay with good enough and not perfect. And also, I think those are the same folks who may have lost perspective that they're no longer perfect as caregivers either. They can't do anymore yet when they do, once someone's placed or whatever, and you see them continually, also provide care that they're paying for, they sort of disable the community itself from doing what they've paid for. They try to micromanage and control every piece of it. And to what end? And to what end? Is their loved one going to get any better care? Are they going to feel any better, if lunch was served at 12 o'clock versus 12:10? And so I think that sometimes that relinquishing the control piece requires a lot of support and help. Sometimes more education even about the illness or the disease process. But sometimes that emotional support of just letting that go.
Right. I see a therapist for the caregiver as being so crucial because they can help them maybe at times refine themselves so that they do start and maybe have accountability to do the things that they used to do or want to do or haven't done, and take more responsibility for their own structured time and their own enjoyment of things instead of continuing to do what they were doing, except it's no longer necessary, and to their own detriment, really.
Yeah, it's interesting. Before you mentioned the word control, Laura, which I know we talked about in our last segment, that was what was coming to mind for me. And I think the combination of control and emotions. So like I've even heard in my family, like, don't you ever dump me in a nursing home and forget about me. And that's probably the mildest of some of the things that are said along those lines. And so I've got to imagine a huge amount of guilt or shame that comes with putting someone where they need to be to get the level of care they need, but then relinquishing the responsibility or control to be there because they don't want their patient spouse to feel like they've been abandoned or forgotten or things like that. And I'm not suggesting there's an easy solution for that one, but I've got to imagine that certainly makes things even more tricky in these types of circumstances.
Well, it really does. And I think one of the things that is important, and I mean, certainly that I validate for family caregivers, is that your job is to make sure that they are cared for and to make sure that they are healthy and safe as best you can. It is not necessarily to provide those things yourself with your own body and mind. And sometimes families really need that permission because they always are forced or mom made them promise to never place, and I don't think that's fair.
That's not
I don't think that's fair.
Kept. You just don't know. So that's a difficult promise. So you may want to shift what the promise is to something that's more reasonable and realistic. And one of the things I used to say in support groups is you will always be the primary caregiver, whether you are the chief hiney wiper or bath giver. You still get to lose all the sleep. So nobody's going to take that away from you, but you don't have to physically be providing the care. It doesn't diminish your role in any way.
One thing I'd like to touch on, which you both kind of mentioned directly or indirectly in our conversation today, is setting expectations and planning ahead. So like Lisa, you mentioned, finally making the decision to put your spouse into a care facility, but maybe having waited too late and it being a nursing home as opposed to assisted living or something not quite on that end of the spectrum. Laura, you talked about setting expectations as it relates to control and what kind of care expectations are there, things like that. I think I know the answer to this, but when is it too early to start planning for having these conversations, thinking about how you or how your spouse wants to be cared for in the event that they find themselves in a situation like this?
I think it's never too early to have those conversations.
Same thing.
I mean,
You would
I
have
think
surprised me if you had said otherwise, but go ahead.
yeah, I think it's never too early. I think, and I know at least in my life, and probably similarly for Lisa, I mean, when you know of a situation or you've learned of a situation, one of the things that, I tend to do is to say out loud, my goodness, if I were in this situation, this is what I would want. But also getting those documents in order that at the bare minimum tell others what you want and tell which others are supposed to be making the decision. But there's a lot of things that those documents don't cover. And so I think having the conversations and maybe finding other ways to write those things down or to discuss those with your people who are important to you, so that they know, because goodness, anyone could have a debilitating car accident any day, and would what I wanted? Well, I mean, yes, some people would know what I wanted because I've discussed it, but I think anytime that there's a discussion of a particular situation, you could have that conversation.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I totally agree with that. I think the thing that I feel like I want to share is that I've run into folks who didn't want to have these discussions for a variety of reasons, fear-based, usually. Fear if they talk about it, it's going to come true. Fear that they're going to hurt somebody's feelings, just a lot of reasons why people don't want to. And then I've run into folks that the elder doesn't want to have that discussion because they don't want to be a burden on their kids. And then I'm like, hang on a second. Not making a decision is a decision, and not planning ahead because you don't want to burden your kids when everything falls from beneath you. Now you're a burden because you didn't have the discussion, you didn't plan, you didn't sign documents, you didn't do any of those things. Now you are a problem. So planning ahead and having these conversations and making sure that people really do know what you want is not where the burden lies. That's just being a responsible, caring, compassionate, good communicator. And those are good things. And while the family may not always want to talk about this stuff, these are fierce conversations. They're important conversations. And seeing that the holidays are coming up, and I think we mentioned this last week, this is a great time to start gently dabbling in these really serious conversations. And maybe while it's not a crisis, like humor, again, it can be a good place to lighten what it is instead of waiting till it's a crisis and now we don't know what to do.
I think so. And also revisiting some of those expectations, perhaps, because if you're at the Thanksgiving table and someone says to you, you're never putting me in a home, I think it's okay to say, you know what, that may not be realistic.
You're not living with me.
Right. That may be a time to just float the idea out there that perhaps there are some unrealistic expectations about, because you can say things like, well, do you have long-term care insurance? Well, have you thought about how you're going to pay for the care you do need? Well, what happens? What happens? And so, I mean, I'm not saying, blow up your whole family meal with a nursing home fight, but I am saying, if you hear an unrealistic expectation, like I never or always, or I think it's an important time to just, again, just discuss those expectations and say, there are sometimes times where it can't be avoided, and just let that be there in the room and just let it sit for a minute. It's okay.
All right, folks, you heard it here from Laura. When you're sitting down for
Thanksgiving
or your holiday meals with your family, that is the time to hit the nail between the eyes with the big questions. No, I appreciate both your comments, and I agree that coming from a planning profession, it's never too early to plan or have conversations or get things out in the sunlight and just, talk about it. So I
They're
think
less
that's
scary, frankly. I think that people avoid these conversations from fear. And then when you start opening up that conversation, suddenly it's not so scary anymore. So I love that you kind of said, shed the light on it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I think that's a great place to wrap it up today. So I appreciate both Lisa and Laura joining me for this conversation, and look forward to continuing it in the next segment. So everyone listening, watching, thanks for joining us, and we will catch you on the next episode of Women's Retirement Radio.